You oversaw a lot at DHS, and including immigration, enforcement. Um, Now Trump is planning something very different from what we've seen in the past. He says he plans to begin mass deportation like day one. JD Vance has said they aim to deport 1 million people each year of their term and target criminals first. What are your concerns about this policy?
Well, first of all, it's a little unclear what their actual policy is or how it's different from the policy we had in the Obama administration or that Biden has had in terms of who gets priority for deportation. Serious criminals, recent border crossers, national security threats. Those were the priority under Obama. They've been the priority under Biden, and it sounds like they're the priority under Trump. So that part is really hard to see what the big difference is. It's also hard to understand what they mean by mass deportation. Uh, uh, Obama was known as the deporter in chief when I was secretary because we really focused on those priorities and particularly recent border crossers. Um, uh, I think in our high year, we probably had 400 some odd thousand deportations. And then it's gone down. And so um, right now, I heard Secretary Mayorkas on the radio this morning, and he was saying that last year they deported 250,000, which was more than Trump had deported in his last full year in office. So the notion that you can suddenly quadruple that is it will be hard to do just logistically. First of all, you've got to find the people that you're going to deport, and that means going into jails and prisons and so forth. And there are many cities and states in the country that say, you know what, that's local law enforcement, that's state law enforcement, that's not immigration. And so they kind of keep those things separate. Um,
Meaning
it's
they wouldn't let federal officials into the jails?
Yeah,
Huh.
yeah. And um, and the way it's supposed to, the way it works now is that when ICE has an order of deportation for somebody, and somebody's in a jail or a prison, they give that jail or prison what's called a detainer, meaning that when that person becomes eligible for release, they are detained there until ICE can come and pick them up, right? And that process worked under Obama. We did orders of detainer. I assume that's what they've been doing under Biden. I don't know what difference Trump intends to make in that process. But regardless, even if you focus on those priorities, getting to over 1 million people a year, that that's a very high number. And people will say, well, there's 10 or 11 million people in the country already who are undocumented. Nobody really knows the actual number. Um, and uh, and so then once you get beyond the recent border crossers, the those already in jail or in prison, um, it's hard to say, well, okay, how do you identify and find the rest? And that is a challenge for ICE. And they frankly they don't have enough people to do that. I mean, they just don't. So what I hear the Trump people saying coming in is they want to cooperate more with state and local law enforcement. But again, they'll get some cooperation, but in many places, state and local law enforcement will say, our job is, keeping the streets safe and dealing with, robberies and domestic violence and drug crime on the streets and stuff. We're not immigration officers, and we're not trained to be immigration officers. So they will not get universal participation there. And remember, you know, in terms of the border itself, the southwest border, those cities, there are very few large communities along the border. I mean, I was the governor of Arizona before I became secretary, and those are sparsely populated counties with very small law enforcement departments and tiny jails. They're not really set up to be uh, a large augmentation force to the federal government.
So given all that, do you think I mean, are there enough undocumented people who are also criminals to primarily target them? And I mean, this gets to the larger question is, LA, like 30% of Los Angeles's population is undocumented people, many of whom have worked and lived there for years, paying taxes, owning businesses, et cetera. Could families like that get swept up in this?
Well, it- it's conceivable. But again, unless you have ICE authorized to basically go down the street and ask everybody for their papers, which is not consistent with US law. It's like, how do you find these people? And then how do you effect an arrest? And then once they're arrested, how do you detain them? Where do you detain them? How do you get to the place of arrest to a place of detention? They're talking about building these big camps in Texas. Well, to get from California to Texas, you need a plane. So you got to have a plane to take you there. And then even once they are ordered deported, they have to go to a country that's willing to take them back. And with many, many undocumented immigrants, their countries don't take them back. And so then what do you do? So it's a real it's a logistical nightmare. And to me, it's not smart, effective law enforcement.
Can I follow up with two specific things in that? One is you said that just asking people to show their papers is not in line with US law. What would that violate? And could an executive order undo that law?
I think it would violate the Constitution against unreasonable searches and seizures, amongst other things. And of course, executive orders can't override the Constitution. Now, they may try it, and then it'll have to be litigated. But
Do undocumented people have
Americans generally, and the population generally, has resisted having any form of a national ID or a national ID card because of the uh, fear of invasions of privacy and individual protection. So unlike many countries in the world, we don't have a national ID card. And people don't walk around with their papers. I mean, who walks around with their birth certificate? I don't think I even know what my birth certificate is. So that's a risk.
I remember doing a piece about people who wanted to take some issues for undocumented immigrants to the Supreme Court. And one of the challenges is they don't necessarily have standing under US law in some ways. So are undocumented people protected by the US Constitution by search and seizure constitutional protections?
Yes, if they're in the country, they are
Yeah.
protected.
So it's only in the border zone in the sort of liminal space that it's questionable.
Yeah, and there is a long-standing policy that within 120 miles of the border patrol has greater discretion than it would in the interior of the country.
Oh my God, you're such the right person to ask these questions of. Thank you. You know all the things. Do we have any indication whether there are enough criminal undocumented people in the US to deport 1 million people who are only criminals?
Um, the latest data I saw was that it's not close to 1 million people.
Okay.
But you have to add up who's in jails, which are controlled by counties and sheriffs, versus state prisons, which are generally controlled, by the state, or any other kind of incarceration. So that's really jails and prisons that you have to, and then you have to go through and add them all up. So, and it's a moving number all the time, obviously.
Yeah. So Trump says he's going to use the military to drive these deportations to the quote limits of the law. Do you know what does the law allow for the US military to do on US soil? And can the military resist or take a position on what they engage with?
So there's the active duty military, then there's the National Guard. So let's talk about the National Guard first.